Hey everybody, and welcome to the day. My name is Mr. Martin, and I'll be your host for a few minutes today as we talk about continuity. Now, you know that you're going to be writing this paper, and it's about continuity and change. And we've already talked about two changes, changes with the Japanese American and the African American populations. And so now it's time to talk about a continuity within our city. So what we need to do is we need to look at some data. We need to look at some information to understand what is something that has stayed the same over time. The era that we have been looking at is really from 1920 to 1960 because that's the data that we had. We could have gone a little bit further and gone all the way up to today, but unfortunately, because of the whole distance learning thing, we've been sort of stopped short. So we're really going to focus in on 1920 to 1960. However, we are also making, with the continuity, going to add a little bit of today's information to sort of build on that, or to give us something to talk about as we analyze the continuity. Also, please note that as you are looking at this, you are not going to be writing this paragraph just yet. We're just collecting information right now. At the end of this week, on Thursday, we'll be posting some information on how to write an intro to a CCOT essay and an outro, a conclusion. And then we'll be asking that you start to put that thing together. And I'll also be showing you the basic structure of a continuity paragraph. Surprise, it's exactly the same as a change paragraph. The big difference is that instead of saying why the change happens, you say why the continuity persists. Why does it continue? So let's dive right in. And so I have, of course, I gave an intro, and then I have this slide, which is also an intro. Now that we're pretty good talking about change, it's time to start looking at continuities. We're going to use maps, map data, and a news article, one in particular, to look at the way that the city has remained the same over time. So here's what I'd like you to do during this video. I want you to take notes on what the data says about the beginning of the era and at the end of the era. And of course, you're looking for things that stay the same. I'll be talking about 1920 through 1960, just as I did with the Japanese Americans and African American demographic changes. And I'll be giving you a little bit of information about today as well. So let's dive right in with, first of all, a map of the modern era. This is 2010 census data, and it is pretty close to what's going on today. The interesting thing is that there is some changes that are going to be, there are some changes that are going to be happening in the Central District, which we're not going to get too far into. That's that middle part of the city, right to the right of the word Seattle. You see that it's kind of green. It's gotten less green over time, and that's because of something called gentrification, which we're not going to really talk about for the purposes of this essay. But know that this is basically what your city looks like-ish today. So this is 10 years after this census block data. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that the city is really kind of broken up. The blue is, each blue dot is one person, and blue is for white people. So you can see areas in the map where it is predominantly white. So what should stand out to you is that on the lower left-hand side of the map, that is West Seattle, and it is predominantly white. If you move up the map, directly up, you'll see a couple of different spots that are also predominantly blue, and those are Queen Anne, just above downtown, and you also have Magnolia on the far left, where it says Discovery Park up there. And then as you continue to move north, you have Ballard, and you have Fremont, and you have Wallingford, and those are also predominantly blue. And then as you move over to the far right, over by Lake Washington, you have some more sort of blue edges. But then in between West Seattle and Lake Washington, you've got blue along the water, but then look at all of the red and the green that are down along the middle there. So next to the word Seattle, you have the Central District, and then as you move south, you have Beacon Hill. And so all of that is way more diverse because you have a combination of both red and green with a little bit of blue sprinkled in there. And it is also predominantly people of color that are in those areas. Okay, so that's today. So that's what our city looks like. You have these areas that are predominantly white, and you have these other areas that are a lot more diverse. Beacon Hill, red is certainly the strongest color there, but it is also mixed in with a little bit of blue and a little bit of green and a little bit of yellow, showing that there is increased diversity in those areas. So what I want to do for a moment is to go back and look at some demographic data. So we don't have this kind of map from 1920, which is the start of our era, but please know that all of these numbers are only get higher as you move toward 1920. I just don't have one of these cool sort of interactive maps that break up the census tracts that you see on this map. So this map is showing the percentage of white people that live in this census tract. Okay, so the census, in order to keep the data, breaks the city up into all these little chunks, and then they basically like figure out who lives in these chunks. So this is a breakdown of the percentage of white people that live in a particular census tract. Now, if you look around West Seattle, where Madison is, you see that it's about anywhere from 99.8% white to 100% white. That means that every single person that lives in that census tract is white. And this is 1940. Please note that in 1920, all of these numbers only increase. Again, because it is more white in 1920, it's going to increase in diversity a little bit as time goes on. Now, one thing that should stand out to you is there are those two white areas. It's funny, the color white, and I'm talking about the white population, but there are those two boxes that are white. You see one that says in the middle of the map that says 38.0 and 46.3. Now, those two spots are the International District. And so the 38.0 is around like where Jackson and 5th, as you move up Jackson all the way up toward 12th and moving all the way up to 23rd and Jackson. So that whole stretch right there is the International District. So you have a really high population of, or percentage of Japanese and, Americans and Chinese Americans especially. And so that's really the spot where you see where white people aren't the majority population, and it's just in those two blocks right there, those two white blocks. So we see that the majority of the city is predominantly white, and then you just have a couple of spots in the city where white people are not the majority. So we have this sort of separation and this sort of grouping of people, which you've seen in maps previously. Now, if we move to 1950, it hasn't really changed that much. However, you'll notice that in the International District, that one spot where it was 38 is now 52, which means that more white people have moved into that area. Now, of course, you learn that because of Japanese internment, there were a lot influx of people moving into that area who were white to buy up some of the businesses that were there and some of the homes. And so that's partially that change. But look around the map. If you look up at the north end of the city, north of what's called the Ship Canal, where Lake Union is, it's sort of like where the city is kind of cut in half by water. Look at all those numbers: 99, 99.7, 98.8, 99.6. We don't see 100s anymore, with a couple of exceptions. I think there's 2 100s on this map, but they're almost at 100. So, predominantly white north of the Ship Canal Bridge. And then as you move to the center of the city and to east of downtown, there's diversity. And then come over here to West Seattle, 99.9, 99.6, 99.8. So again, we still have in 1950 predominantly white and also segregated, where you just have these pockets in the center of the city that are diverse, or that where white people are not the majority. Okay, let's jump to the end of this era, which is 1960, and surprise, it stays the same. The north end of the city we still see those numbers: 99.7, 99.5, 98.9. And West Seattle also the same: 99.7, 99.6. So predominantly white still. And yet in that central area where we have the International District and the Central District, look at those numbers in 1960. All of those boxes that are almost totally white: 11.4% white, 19.1% white. That means that only 1 out of every 5 people in that neighborhood are white. So it's predominantly people of color. And we have, especially in those areas, we have mostly African Americans, and we have Japanese and Chinese Americans, and Filipino Americans. So those neighborhoods seem they're sort of changing, and we see diversity kind of growing a little bit. However, that being said, there is still this continuity of there's a segregation that's happening here because the predominantly white neighborhoods are separate from the predominantly diverse neighborhoods. So let's look at all of these maps together. You can see the change over time. You can see the continuity over time where you have the solid colors in the north and southwest parts of the city and basically all of the places that are along the water. And then there's that pocket, there's that central district area, which is an international district, which tends to be more diverse, where you have fewer white folks living in those neighborhoods. So there is that sort of, the elements of segregation, and there are policies that are going to cause that. And so that's sort of the why does this continuity happen as you're looking at these three maps. So we go back to this map, and we see that in the city in 2010, there is a change within this continuity in that a lot of the Asian Americans have moved down along Beacon Hill. The increase in the Asian American population throughout Beacon Hill is apparent in this map. And so that's sort of a change over time. But then look at some of those areas that remain almost solid blue. All along the water, north of the Ship Canal Bridge with the University of Washington, that red area that's there being a counter to that. And then West Seattle, all along the water, and sort of the left side of the West Seattle Peninsula being predominantly white. So it's interesting that if we look at this map, this is a map of diversity. This is called the diversity index. And what it measures is if you were to take two people from a particular census tract or area, what is the likelihood that they would be of two different races? And so if we look around the city, if it's a dark purple color, that means that if you were to take two people from that area, it's likely that they are going to be of the same race. However, in the sort of orange areas that are in the city, if you were to take two people from that area, it is 66 to 77% likely that they would be of two different races. So this is a diversity index again. Now you'll notice that this does share, as we zoom in here to West Seattle, which is blurry, so I'm not going to stay here too long. But as we look at these two maps, there is a trend, right? So the blue and the purple kind of share a lot of the same area. And so what that means is that the city is oftentimes segregated not between all of the different races, but really it's segregated between white folks and people of color. So we have all of these different sections of the city that are very diverse, which are high on the diversity index. And then there are a lot of spots in the city which are not diverse and also at the same time predominantly white. And so if we go back to those maps, those three maps here, we see that pattern that has been in place since at least 1940. And in fact, the numbers only get higher in 1920, which was the beginning of our era. So you see that this is a continuity. Over time, this sort of segregation has persisted. And so as you look at the different maps and you look at the beginning of the era and the end of the era, you can describe those two different maps. And in fact, when you're trying to talk about those, go back to these ones and hit pause. And then talk about the map on the left. And then talk about the map on the right. And you see that basically all of the places where there's solid darker colors are all predominantly white, and they're almost the same in these two maps. And if we did have a map of 1920, it would look basically the same. And if we jump ahead to today, it basically looks the same. So this is a continuity over time in our city, okay? So that's what you need to figure out, because again, in the paragraph, you need to say what the continuity is. Then you need to describe what the place looked like at the beginning of the era and then at the end of the era. And then you need to say why it happens. So why does this persist? Why does this continuity keep on trucking? So what I want you to do, now that we've taken some notes on the different maps and understand the continuity over time, the question is, and this is what you need to answer in your essay, is why has this persisted? You see that segregation in our city has persisted over time from 1940 to 1960 all the way to today. And this article sheds some light on why it has done so. And so you can both or either read or listen to this KUOW report, but you also need to take notes on at least a couple of, that is, 2 reasons why segregation has been a continuity in our city over time. Please note, this is all I'm going to talk about, the reason why, because we're not going to go in detail, because we'll be discussing this more in depth when you start 9th grade. Promises, okay? We'll talk about this when you're in 9th grade at West Seattle High School. If you don't go to West Seattle High School, well, then you're losing out, obviously. But if you are, then we'll be talking about this. If you're not going to West Seattle High School, or you don't think that you will be, let me know, and I'll go more in depth, and I can give you some more reasons as to why this happens, and some primary source documents as to some of the sort of base reasons, the foundational reasons why racial segregation has persisted in our city. Okay, so with that, please go to nowhere. You're just going to be taking notes, and then wait for Thursday, because Thursday we're going to be talking about how to write intro and outro, and how to write a continuity paragraph, even though it's exactly the same as a change paragraph, to set you up for next week, which is essentially just putting this essay all together into a Word document and turning it into your teacher, and then we can enjoy summer. It's going to be totally different from what's happening now with the beautiful weather that's outside and me just being at home all the time with my kids. So anyway, I hope that you guys have a great day. I hope that you're staying sane in the craziness of the world that you are currently living in. And I, as always, hope to see your faces sometime soon. Okay? Talk to you later. Bye now.